Hola, and welcome to Confessions of a Bad Asian with me, your host, Betsy Lynn. We talk with friends who are doing cool shit and have something to say, and who happen to be Asian. Today, we're talking post-election with Sayu Bhojwani, who is a social entrepreneur who has doubled down on working with women of color under the belief that we will be the ones that change the world. You know her as a co-founder of the Women's Democracy Lab, and before that, the founder of the New American Leaders. What you may not know is that Sayu was born in India and moved to Belize by the age of 4. She went to an all-girls Catholic high school and then to college in New York, starting a career in publishing before returning to Belize as a teacher in elementary and high school. She's had quite a career and quite an international perspective. Sayu, welcome to the podcast. First of all, how are you doing and how was your trip?
Thank you, Betsy. I'm excited to be here. And I love the idea of being a bad Asian because that means that I'm doing everything right. If not by my parents' book, by my book. I just came back from Reykjavik, the Global Forum on Women, and also on seeing a lot of theater and art in London, which I could spend a lot of time talking about. But I will just say that one thing that I love about London is how international a city is. I live in New York, which is a diverse city. But there's like a difference between the way that art and culture, how much more blind casting there is in London. And anyway, so like that could be another episode.
That should be another episode around art and culture and maybe a way to take care of ourselves. But I'm glad that you actually got out of the country post-election or took a little break from the domestic politics of the U.S. Maybe you didn't take a break from it, and maybe that was the topic of conversation where you were. But we are currently close to 3 weeks post-election, and we are still definitely in the reverberations of what this election means, coming from the perspective that elections have consequences and elections impact the world that we live in. A lot of conversations are happening around how to move forward. We know that data from swing states is not yet available, but we do have exit polling and polling moving into the elections. And of course, data and anecdotal information from doors and work that was happening around organizing. And as you know and see in this phase of understanding what happened, there are a lot of theories as to why. I am interested in your take on why this happened. And in particular, there are some questions around identity politics and whether the tent is big enough, whether it needs to be smaller enough, or if we should continue down this path of what some are saying are group politics.
Man, I wish that I had the perfect hot take for you, but I'm going to give you some warm takes. I actually have been trying not to participate in the hot takes, but now I guess 3 weeks later, here we are. So one thing I'm going to say is that what I feel we're talking very little about is mis and disinformation and who was responsible for circulating that. And I mention that because when I was abroad, there was much more conversation about that at the Reykjavik Global Forum on Women, for example. I think by ignoring that entire factor and those variables, it makes it easier to blame certain groups. And what we're doing, I think, in that process is not even attempting to understand what people were thinking when they made the decision to vote for Donald Trump. And so we're going to learn nothing if what we do is start pointing fingers and making decisions about how to move forward. It's too early to decide how to move forward if we haven't understood what happened. I think misinformation is a big one. I do think that the busloads of immigrants that Governor Abbott sent to different cities had an impact. It was a very smart move on his part. It unveiled the deep racism, even in so-called liberal cities, who suddenly felt like, wait, these are the folks that are coming here. And I think for those of us who don't live in border states, we often don't encounter large numbers of newly arrived immigrants, right? We're seeing them in smaller numbers. We're seeing them after they've maybe picked up some English, after they've held a couple of jobs. But those busloads of immigrants created and contributed to a dynamic that was already happening in cities that was a function of post-COVID economic challenges and public health challenges. So that, I think, is another factor. But I want to talk a little bit about the party, the Democratic Party, and its repeated lack of strategy for the long term and its repeated lack of investment in building democracy and democratic practice in our states, and its continued focus primarily on Congress and the presidency. It's assumptions that demographics are destiny. It's taken Black voters for granted as its base. It's assumed that other voters of color would follow without any kind of deep investment in building a bench of leadership, in investing in first-time voters. And so all of these things contributed to what happened. And why should we be surprised that immigrants voted just like other Americans in what they considered to be their self-interest? They were told a powerful, snappy, one-dimensional story that their fortunes were going to be affected in a more positive way if Donald Trump was president. And they bought into that, just like every other voter did. So I take real issue with the blaming of certain communities of color, because that is only part of the equation. And also because they acted in response to people who cultivated them as voters when we did not.
That's right. We do know that for folks who have been in politics or in movement for more than a cycle, it was exciting to see a first woman of color lead a major presidential ticket. And there was what felt like true excitement and hope around the candidacy, the very, very shortened candidacy, at least excitement and energy as well. What do you think this means for future runs and for those first-time voters who may have voted for Ms. Harris?
I mean, I think that's I don't want to deny the misogyny and misogynoir that we have in our country, right? So I definitely want to be very clear that I understand that from my work and from my personal experiences. I would like to believe that the factors that were at play far exceeded anything that we were doing as a party and that she was doing as a candidate. To pretend that her race and her gender were not an issue would be naive. But I do think that coupled with a strategy that, like, for example, for future candidacies, I think we need a better strategy. I don't think it's about a better candidate. I think it's about a better strategy. I think that Kamala Harris is one of the most qualified people to run for president, if not the most qualified. I don't think that this was about her qualifications. Now, on a personal level, I do think that she could have leaned more into her race and her gender. And that comes from the fact that I started an organization 14 years ago called the American Leaders. And a core tenet of our training was to lean into the immigrant experience as an asset rather than a liability. But I think that Kamala Harris worked incredibly hard. She inspired many of us. I don't think that it is fair to ascribe the loss to who she was as a person and how she ran her campaign as an individual. I think it's very much more about the party and the system, the way that the party tends to operate. And her role in that is something that we could talk about. But I don't think it's about her as a candidate.
Right. I do want to get that thread about inspiration and energy in this conversation about moving forward. In particular, there is an entire crew that has been activated by this first-time candidacy. We are now facing something very different for our future in the next 4 years, if not longer, in terms of the systems changes that will be happening in the next 4 years. Trump himself, and during his campaign, talked about mass deportations of illegal immigrants. You yourself have served as the first commissioner of immigrant affairs in New York City and are an immigrant yourself. Is there a place to start with immigration as a way to get people motivated to take the next step forward to still be in community with each other? And what are the things that you think we can do?
Obviously, the people who are going to be most affected by this are individual immigrants, and particularly those who are undocumented or related to those who are undocumented. But the next line of defense is going to be frontline workers. So I think that we all can do a lot to support frontline service organizations, because people are going to be afraid and they're not going to want to interact with government agencies. And I know this from my personal experience, because not only was I Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs, I was Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs in New York City 6 months after September 11th. So I definitely am experiencing a very unpleasant deja vu at the moment. What I would say is that there's also a responsibility that local leaders have to create a bulwark against the Trump administration. So that's doubling down on sanctuary policies. That is for elected officials who can move resources to local nonprofits. That is ensuring that our government employees understand the sanctuary policy so that, I think the things that we don't think about is how often undocumented immigrants are connected to people who are documented. So that's undocumented parents of American-born school children. They have to drop their kids off to school. I think that people don't know. I don't barely know the difference between what a sheriff does and what a local police officer does, and obviously what immigration authorities do. So the fear is not going to be experienced only in one interaction, that there's like constant fear that is going to be part of their daily experience. And so whatever we can do to create local policies and to provide resources, I think is really important. I think that is the best that we're going to be able to do. I don't want to pretend as if we can reimagine immigration policy during this administration. However, I do want to say that aside from immigration, not aside from immigration, but including immigration, I think we have a responsibility to reimagine the world that we want, as opposed to just focusing on resistance. Because I think the last cycle, when he first got elected, there was a focus on resistance. But at the time, we didn't know how many of our immigrant brothers and sisters were going to support someone like Trump. And so we do have some reckoning to do and some reimagining to do about how we do our work in terms of engaging our communities.
Mm-hmm. Many of our colleagues have said during briefings, we can't do the same playbook that we did in 2016. That will not work. We are in a different world, a world where there's less guardrails for what government could do, including a trifecta on the federal side. So in terms of the reckoning to do that work, how do you see that path forward? What do you think needs to happen? Some of that will be your own personal vision of what needs to happen for yourself, but also from a movement perspective, what do you think needs to happen next?
I'm going to stick by the strategy that we've talked about for 14 years, or that I've talked about for 14 years, which is that we need a state-based strategy and we need a local strategy. We need to continue supporting the elected officials from our communities who are holding office and getting more of them in there so that they can create at least some cocoons of safety across this large country. I think we shouldn't write off any state at all. I think there's a tendency, but if you go to Kansas, there are immigrants and communities of color in Kansas. And we should be looking at all of those places. So that is one thing that I think on the progressive side, we have not always done. We have ignored certain states. And it's not even just about flyover country. It's about just assuming that a state is going to be red or blue in a presidential election. But there are people in those states. And so I think local and state strategy is really important. I think continuing to focus on systemic reforms within that is also important. And then I would say, in terms of the individual and community level, I'm thinking a lot about what my care infrastructure is going to be. Who are the people that I'm going to be in contact with and in community with regularly? What are going to be my touchstones for routine physical and mental care? The places that I'm going to turn to for inspiration and hope, which for me is our writings, but also direct community work, I think is always very inspiring. I have a substack that I can share out later, but the other two categories of preparation, if you will, that I'm doing besides creating and strengthening my care infrastructure is cleaning up clutter. And kind of getting...
Are you Marie Kondoing your world?
Well, it's cluttering more in the sense of I think that there will be a certain paralysis that some of us will experience at different times after Donald Trump is officially in the White House. And so between now and January, the hard things that I need to do, I'm trying to get done. I'm also traveling, trying to, and I recommend this. I'm saying I'm doing it, but I'm recommending to people that they take that special trip that they were planning to take with a friend or a family member. So clearing up the clutter. And the other thing that we all have to think about is, what is the role that we actually want to play? We're not going to be able to do everything. What am I best suited for? And how am I going to do that next year, as opposed to responding to everything and reacting to everything, because that is going to be exhausting. And most of us have already been through the first administration in our leadership roles. In my case, this is my third iteration, like after September 11th. And I just feel like we have to preserve our energy. But so community care and clarity.
I really appreciate the piece around, instead of responding, actually thinking about the role that we want to play. I tell a lot of my allies, we've got to think beyond what my next step is for next year. It needs to be, how am I helping and utilizing some of my privilege to help and be in partnership with folks. Is there anything else you would say to the allies who are allies in the world?
I feel like we have to really be clear about who our allies actually are. Like, people we have assumed to be allies are not always allies. So I like to think about people who are actually intersectional in their thinking and who are focused on transformation of systems, rather than having me at the table as part of their United Colors of Benetton. I mean, really, like I think
I'm laughing because yes, I know what you mean.
Yeah, I don't want to be your immigrant friend or your woman of color who you call for, oh my God, what do I do? I'm like, what were you doing for the last 20 years, And so to me, I see that. So there's two parts, right? One is, how do you preserve your own energy by really being in allyship with people who are values aligned. So let's say that. I do think there's a second part of this that, maybe is just kind of transactional, which is, there's going to be allies to get certain things done. But I feel we have often conflated the two. And that's why some of us are like, oh, holy...
You can say it.
This is
We're
how
actually
this person...
cursing in this.
Holy shit, is this person really an ally? When you think about, for example, with Gaza and Palestine, and like how many of us had to really sort of think, well, am I able to say this? Like, if you're in a conversation with someone and you're having to think, can I actually speak my mind?
Right.
That's what I mean when I say, is that person really an ally?
Yep. When you have to monitor what you're saying because you're worried that this might ruin a partnership or a friendship. And so it does make the question, are they really a partner or a friend or ally? Mm-hmm. I think that makes a ton of sense here. Speaking of flyover states, I was in Ohio for Sherrod Brown's race. One of my allies was there, and I had the opportunity to door knock a lot. 25 miles of door knocking in the state of Ohio.
That's amazing.
I love doing it because it really gives you the feel. And
for sure.
One of the last conversation that I had at the door was with a guy who was going to vote for Sherrod Brown, Donald Trump, on the issue of abortion, because he believes women should have their rights, but didn't put together that Donald Trump was the one who took away reproductive rights. So It was such a huge piece of understanding folks outside of the folks that we normally talk to inside of the bubble, but also seeing where some of the thought process was missing there. One of the things that Sherrod Brown actually said in a post-election podcast was, he was asked the question of, oftentimes the working class gets pitted against the needs of communities of color. Is there anything else you would add to this piece around working class versus communities of color? And how do you look at, to me, it's working class sometimes gets seen as white working class.
Exactly.
But communities of color are traditionally working class.
Well, you answered it. Like, that's what I think. I think that there is and I remember this from the 2016 election, that we kept talking about the working class, but really what people were talking about was, or Rust Belt workers. And that ignored the fact that among those working class voters were Latinos and were Asian Americans. And so this kind of, the way that, like, let's say the way that turf is cut at the national level is in these very problematic categories that really don't affect the diverse let me start that. The turf is cut in a way that is, and I know that's not, the term is not turf is cut at the national level, but I think we categorize these voters.
Right. We target at the national level for sure. And then
you target them, but you're targeting these categories that are actually overlapping categories, like Latino voters and working class voters. I mean, there's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah.
And so how can we be more nuanced about people and what their needs are? And if we learned anything from this, we learned that immigrants are going to vote like other Americans, which God knows we've been saying for a long time. So it's not like anything new. And
shocker, immigrants are people too.
Yeah, right? And I mean, we did the most American thing we could do this year is we voted in our self-interest. And that to me is like one of our fundamental challenges. The work ahead is how are we going to come out of our own self-interest, including, by the way, this idea of talking to a Trump voter in our family. Mm-hmm. If the goal of talking to our Trump voter in our family, if you start off with the assumption that he, she, they were wrong, and that your job is to convince them that they were wrong, then we're already not starting from a place of openness, right? We're starting from a place of assuming that we are right. And so what I've been doing, I am particularly puzzled by the number of immigrants in my world who voted for Trump and their assumptions about new immigrants and their assumptions about what Trump is going to be able to do as a leader have just been so fascinating for me to listen to. And so I'm trying to listen from a place of understanding rather than converting, and finding, sort of to your common ground point, I'm trying to find common ground as a way of planting seeds for ongoing conversation. So it's not finding common ground to say, okay, well, we're going to have this family dinner together based on common ground so I can tolerate you. But it's finding common ground so that I can continue to listen and be open. And I'm not ready. I'm not going to pretend. Like sometimes they say things and I'm like, I need to have this conversation with you later because you're batshit crazy. But where that is coming from, so the misinformation piece is really remarkable. And we have thought that stuff, those videos that our dad send us, our uncles send us, we're like, this is nonsense. Why are you listening to this? But actually, people really believe that stuff. And so I feel like we have to be more ready to hear where people are coming from. And then once we understand, then we can say, okay, well, let me tell you what I think. But if it's all about you're wrong and he's crazy, which is true. I mean, not that they're wrong, but that he is crazy.
Right.
But that's a conversation closer rather than a conversation starter.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great way to take a look at it. You know, there are a series of different movements that are also happening to protect oneself going into 2025 and beyond. You've maybe heard of the 4B movement. Just your thoughts on that.
I think this is like an example of what I mean in terms of reimagination. How are we going to reimagine the world that we live in? I'm married to a wonderful man, so I will not be, shutting him out. And I think this is a moment for us to, apparently Pluto is in Aquarius or something. And that means that we have a 20-year period of reimagining things. And to me, the most fundamental thing is going to be, can we reimagine outside of just self-centeredness? Because if we stay there, it's just hard to see how we're going to get to a place of collective liberation.
That's right.
I mean, that's how I feel.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for your thoughts on this. And we are nearing the end of our podcast session. And also thank you for re-recording this interview, knowing that we had a different interview already done from a few weeks ago. This felt important to get on the books, and this felt important to get your voice now that the ground has shifted for us collectively. Before we close out, I do have two last questions, which are questions I ask of every guest on this show. First of all, what makes you a bad Asian? And then the second question is, are there any projects or things that you would like to talk about that you're working on right now?
Yeah, well, I don't know. What makes me a bad Asian, I think, depends on who you ask. But I feel like I'm really doing my own internal work. I'm really trying to examine my own anti-Blackness and my own sort of both the benefits that I have had as a result of being a model minority and how to divest from some of that or how to leverage some of those privileges. But maybe that makes me a good Asian. I don't know. I definitely didn't do, I don't make money.
That's me clapping.
That makes me a really bad Asian. I do not make enough money. I leave good jobs to go make less money. And wait, what was the second question?
Projects that you're working on right now. And I definitely want to make sure that you talk about your Substack and promo it here as well.
Yeah. Okay. So first and foremost, my number one Immigrant Daughter Substack. Some of what I was talking about in terms of care infrastructure and like that was in the last post. I will be writing more about mass deportations and other things like that through the Substack. So I think that's a good place. Even if you're not a number one Immigrant Daughter, it's a good Substack to follow. And if I'm being totally honest, I'm really trying to figure out what my next big job is going to be. And I say big job meaning because I'm consulting right now and I'm very happy with that. And I'm writing fiction, there'll be something published next week that I hope to share on my Substack. So if you subscribe, you'll see it. But I'm trying to think about a way back to these questions about like, what is the impact I'm going to have? I feel like we're all going to need to be real clear about how we're spending our days. And so what I say is one foot in front of the other, and it'll help to have the structure of a job with meaning and purpose, even though my life has meaning and purpose, but I think it'll be helpful to do that. So stay tuned for that.
I love this. I love all of this, and I can't wait to hear. This will probably come out at the same time as your new writing will, so we'll make sure to include that as part of the written description on the podcast itself. The podcast is Confessions of a Bad Asian with Betsy Lynn. You can find us on any of the streaming platforms, Apple, Spotify, all of the platforms. And we will see you again next month. Thank you so much, Sayu.
Thanks, Betsy. It was great to be here and have a chance to process stuff that I haven't really been able to process out loud.
Thank you.